Hi everyone, I'll take you through the 8th chapter, The Globalization of Inequality by P. Sainath. To begin with, I would like to read out a line that is quoted in the work. This is a line: Our planet is not balanced. Too few control too much, and too many have too little to hope for. Too much turmoil, too many wars, too much suffering. Now, these are the lines of James Wolfenson, president of the World Bank. Now, look at these lines. It pretty much sums up inequality for us. Okay? He says that our planet is not balanced. Too few control too much, and too many have too little to hope for. Too much turmoil, too many wars, and too much suffering. So, this is what is going to be discussed in this chapter. How does globalization and inequality go hand in hand in a country like India? What is the relationship between globalization and inequality? And before that, this is about the author, Sainath. Sainath is an Indian journalist and author of the book Everybody Loves a Good Drought. He was awarded the Ramon Magsaysay Award in 2007 for believing that journalism is for people, not for shareholders, and for writing about those who have been left behind. Now, he founded what is known as the People's Archive of Rural India in 2014, an online platform that focuses on social and economic inequality, rural affairs, poverty, and the aftermath of globalization in India. Okay, this is the author, and this he often writes in various journals, and he's a very well-known person as far as rural studies about rural India is concerned. Now, this is also a news item on him. P. Sainath calls for Parliament session on farmers' rights, implementation of M.S. Swaminathan panel report. Okay, and there he is. Now, the chapter that we will be looking at, The Globalization of Inequality, is actually an extract from his article, The Globalization of Inequality, published in 2004. Okay, so this article is a part of a larger article which was published in 2004. Therefore, when we talk of facts and figures, we'll also look at some current statistics, because we do not want to depend entirely on the figures of 2004. Now, after James Wolfenson's words, we look at what are the key ideas discussed in the chapter. Now, the first main idea is, of course, inequality, and there is one line that I would like to read out from the text. Of the many trends in globalization, the crucial one today is corporate globalism, a world driven by and for corporate profits, based on corporate greed rather than human need. It's a world marked by the collapse of restraint on corporate power in every continent. So, this is a very key line in the book that pretty much sums up what inequality is all about and how inequality comes about. So, there is a huge gap between what the haves have, the people who are powerful or rich have, and the people who are poor have. There's a huge gap, and the gap seems to be widening in a country like ours. And P. Sainath notes that this is a very alarming trend that we are seeing in our economy. All right. So, now, so that you understand what exactly is a concern here, I want you to look at a very recent statistics. This came in the Economic Times on January 20th, 2020. All right. Now, pay attention to this. What does this say? Now, the Economic Times points out that India's richest 1%, all right, the richest 1% of people hold more than 4 times wealth held by 953 million people put together, who make up for the bottom 70% of the country's population. All right. And the total wealth of the billionaires in the country is greater than the full year budget of the country. Do you understand why this chapter is important? This chapter is important because P. Sainath says that there is this widening gap between the rich and the poor. And you know that that kind of an imbalanced society is not good in the long run. It will create social injustice, it will create social unrest, it will create a lot of problems, and in the long run, probably it will not even lead to a holistic development of the country. There'll be a lot of social issues which will ultimately become a financial problem also for the rich people, okay, the so-called rich people. All right. So look at this figure again. India's richest 1% hold more than 4 times wealth. Okay. More than 4 times wealth held than the wealth held by 953 million people put together, who comprises of which actually is 70% of country's population. So definitely this is an alarming situation that we have at hand. Now I would also like to draw your attention to a report by Oxfam. Oxfam is a rights group. Oxfam is actually a confederation of 20 independent charitable organizations, and it focuses on alleviation of global poverty. It's a non-profit organization actually, and they bring out all these inequality reports and all those things. And now in their report, Time to Care, the rights group Oxfam notes that world's merely 2000 odd billionaires, 2153 billionaires of the world own more wealth than 4.6 billion people put together, who make up for 60% of planet's population. So just 2000 people, all right, 2100 people own more money, more wealth than 4.6 billion people put together. Now, this is the alarming rate of inequality that we can see in the world. And this is a line by Oxfam India CEO Amitabh Bahar. The gap between rich and poor cannot be resolved without deliberate inequality busting policies, and too few governments are committed to these. All right, so he says that the scenario really doesn't look good, because the gap between the rich and the poor cannot be resolved without deliberate inequality busting policies, and a lot of governments really do not look interested at all. Now, what I have done, like I've done in the previous chapter, is that I've broken down the chapter as small questions so that you understand the concepts. Now, there is something called shock therapy that is mentioned in the chapter. Now, the context is there is reference to Russia in the chapter. Okay. Now, the main points discussed in this chapter are inequality, how inequality affects different countries, how privatization has increased inequality in different countries, and probably what governments should do to reduce this kind of rising inequality. Now, there is a reference to Russia here, because you see, before 1991, before the USSR broke up, there wasn't Russia, it was the USSR. Now, in 1991, when USSR disintegrated and Russia was formed, immediately after that, the Russian government wanted to revive the economy, which was actually not in a good shape. So what they adapted was something called the shock therapy, that is the sudden disinvestment of government from the public spheres. The government sold its companies, it encouraged privatization, and what happened in the end was that there was massive loot and grab. A few rich people grabbed all these companies, and the Russian system became an oligarchy. An oligarchy means a few rich people started running everything. All right. So shock therapy. So in that context, we have to answer when you ask a question. We asked a question in the exam. What is shock therapy? You have to answer with all these things in mind. So let me take you through the answer. The term shock therapy refers to the concept of figuratively shocking or shaking up the economy with sudden and dramatic economic policies that affect prices and employment. Okay, shock therapy is a sudden change in the economy. Now, you see, China also tried to revive its economy, and China actually adopted what is called gradualism. They did not plunge into, or they did not adopt what is known as a shock therapy, but they did things gradually, and that's known as gradualism. But the model that Russia adopted was called shock therapy. Characteristics of shock therapy include the ending of price controls, the privatization of publicly owned entities, all right, so this massive privatization all of a sudden, and trade liberalization, all right. So what Russia did was it was shifting from this socialism mode to kind of a capitalist economy, and so it did it very fast. It suddenly ended all the price controls, privatization of publicly owned entities happened, and trade liberalization. It also includes steps like stopping government subsidies and bringing tighter fiscal policies such as higher tax rates and lowered government funding. So government actually takes a step back from funding public enterprises and everything. It takes a step back, and private enterprises, private people have more more say in the economy. Now, economist Jeffrey Sachs is widely associated with shock therapy. He developed a plan of shock therapy for post-communist Poland. See, Jeffrey Sachs is a person who is most widely known as far as shock therapy is concerned. And he implemented shock therapy. He helped in the implementation of shock therapy in different countries like Poland, Bolivia, Chile, and so on. Now, in Poland, Bolivia, and Chile, shock therapy kind of worked, but in Russia, we cannot say it was an absolute failure, but then it really did not work like it had to. All right. So, economist Jeffrey Sachs is widely associated with shock therapy. He developed a plan of shock therapy for post-communist Poland in 1990, for post-communist Russia in 1992, and several other countries like Bolivia and Chile. Bolivia and Poland benefited from shock therapy, but in Russia, shock therapy did not produce favorable outcomes. What happened? Almost all of Russia's industries were undervalued and sold to private individuals and companies, and they were acquired by a few Russian oligarchs. Who is an oligarch? An oligarch is a member of an oligarchy, or a person who is part of a small group holding power in a state. With limited government intervention, most industries disappeared. The Russian currency declined, causing high inflation and the erosion of citizens' savings. Unemployment increased in Russia drastically, and government subsidies were removed, further pushing Russian families into poverty. So in Russia, shock therapy was not much of a success, because when the government suddenly withdrew from all the establishments and selling of all the government companies and everything, a few very rich people grabbed all these things and they used it for their own welfare rather than for the welfare of the country. And it just pushed large number of Russian people into poverty. Now, you can, for more, if you want, you can visit Investopedia, but I think this should be enough for you to write the answers. I think this should be more than enough. Now, the next question is, what is one example that the author cites to show that there is massive inequality in Russia? Yes, so there is one example that he notes, so just study that. The author notes that in the Russian winter, hundreds die of the cold. In 2000 and 2001, well over 300 died in Moscow alone of hypothermia. But in the same year, season sales of Mercedes-Benz cars in Moscow leaped by 1/3. You see, on one hand, all these fancy cars are being sold, and on the other, people die of winter because they do not have basic clothing or housing and proper food, and they die. Next question, what is gangster capitalism? This again has to do with Russia. Gangster capitalism is a phrase, no, or phase, sorry, a phase in Russian history when the country was transitioning from communism to state capitalism. The terminology describes the period of lawlessness that gripped the country in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union and a time when Russia saw rapid privatization with rigged auctions and fraudulent sales. All right, just as Russia was transitioning into a capitalist economy, we learned before, there was this massive grabbing of all government entities by private people. There was a rise of this kind of forceful grabbing and all sorts of illegal activity in Russia, and auctions were all rigged. Auctions were all fraudulent, and few people grabbed all the assets of the country. So this is known in Russian history as gangster capitalism. All right. So gangster capitalism is a phase in Russian history when the country was transitioning from communism to state capitalism, and the terminology describes a period of lawlessness that gripped the country in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union and a time when Russia saw rapid privatization with rigged auctions and fraudulent sales. We'll stop there, and the next will come as the second part.